In the spring of 1930, 4 identical baby girls entered the world in Lansing, Michigan, and with them came a darkness that would haunt American psychiatry for nearly a century. The Morlok quadruplets became instant celebrities, their angelic faces gracing newspapers from coast to coast. But behind the carefully orchestrated public image lay a house of horrors that would drive all 4 sisters to madness by their 24th birthday. What really happened in that small, clapboard home on Lansing's east side? And why did government researchers spend decades studying these women while deliberately ignoring the Nazi sympathizer who terrorized them? The case files, sealed for decades in government archives, reveal a story so disturbing that even hardened psychiatrists struggled to document the full scope of what they discovered. 4 identical children, born into what appeared to be a loving American family, systematically destroyed by a father whose obsessions with racial purity and patriarchal control created a laboratory of psychological torture that would make his daughters famous for all the wrong reasons. Before we continue with the story of the Morlok family and their tragic descent into what scientists would later call dire birth, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from, because this American nightmare could have happened anywhere. The warning signs were there, hidden in plain sight, in a community that chose to look away rather than confront the darkness growing behind white picket fences. The birth announcement that would change everything appeared in the Lansing State Journal on May 19, 1930. But few could have predicted the decades of exploitation and suffering that would follow. Lansing in 1930 was a city caught between 2 worlds, its smokestack skyline rising above tree-lined residential streets where American dreams were supposed to flourish. The capital of Michigan had grown rapidly during the automotive boom, drawing families like Carl and Sadie Morlok from across the Midwest with promises of steady work and middle-class respectability. The Oldsmobile factory provided employment for thousands, its assembly lines running day and night to meet the growing demand for automobiles that symbolized American prosperity. The city's neighborhoods reflected the social stratification of the era. The West Side housed the professional class, doctors, lawyers, and factory managers who lived in substantial Victorian homes with manicured lawns and wraparound porches. The East Side, where the Morloks would eventually settle, was home to factory workers, recent immigrants, and families still climbing toward respectability. Here, the houses were smaller but well-maintained, their owners taking pride in fresh paint, clean windows, and gardens that bloomed with the same flowers their neighbors chose. Carl Morlok had arrived in America as a young boy with his German immigrant mother, Bertha, who had filled his head with stories of Germanic superiority and warnings about the corruption of American society by inferior peoples. Bertha Morlok was a woman haunted by her own demons. She had suffered what doctors called a nervous breakdown in her late teens, spending 3 years in and out of psychiatric institutions. The experience had left her with paranoid delusions about racial contamination and conspiracy theories that she passed on to her son like a poisonous inheritance. Carl worked as a laborer at the Oldsmobile plant, his thick accent and authoritarian demeanor making him few friends among his co-workers. Those who knew him described a man consumed by paranoid obsessions about protecting his family's purity and reputation, though most dismissed his occasional outbursts as the harmless eccentricities of a foreign-born patriarch struggling to fit into American society. His supervisors noted that he was a reliable worker, but avoided social interactions, often eating lunch alone while reading German-language newspapers that arrived weeks late from overseas. The boarding house where Carl lived before his marriage was a grim 3-story building that housed 24 single men, most of them immigrants working in the city's factories. His room was spartanly furnished but obsessively clean, with religious imagery covering one wall and photographs of German landscapes adorning another. His fellow boarders remembered him as quiet but intense, given to late-night pacing and muttered conversations in German that seemed to be arguments with invisible opponents. Sadie Mueller had met Carl at a church social in 1925, drawn to his serious demeanor and old-world courtesies. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a railroad worker who had died in an industrial accident when she was 16. Her mother had remarried quickly, and Sadie found herself unwelcome in her stepfather's house, eager for marriage as an escape from an uncomfortable domestic situation. Their courtship followed traditional patterns, with Carl visiting Sadie's family home on Sunday afternoons, the two of them sitting in the front parlor under the watchful eye of her mother. Carl spoke little during these visits, but his attention to Sadie was intense and unwavering. He brought her small gifts, flowers, chocolates, books of German poetry that she couldn't read but treasured anyway. When he proposed after 6 months of courtship, Sadie accepted eagerly, seeing in marriage the security and respectability she craved. The wedding, held in November 1925 at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, was a modest affair attended by Sadie's family and a few of Carl's co-workers. The reception was held in the church basement, with sandwiches and coffee served on tables covered with white cloths that Sadie had embroidered herself. Carl's mother, Bertha, attended but spent most of the evening sitting alone in a corner, watching the other guests with suspicious intensity. The newlyweds rented a small apartment above a bakery on Lansing's east side, the smell of fresh bread and pastries providing a warm backdrop to their early married life. Sadie threw herself into creating a perfect domestic environment, sewing curtains, arranging furniture, and learning to cook the German dishes that reminded Carl of his childhood. She had married young and quickly learned to navigate Carl's explosive temperament through careful observation of his moods and preemptive accommodation to his preferences. Carl's behavior in private was markedly different from his public persona. At work and in the community, he maintained a facade of respectability, but at home, his controlling nature emerged fully. He monitored Sadie's activities, questioned her about conversations with neighbors, and established detailed rules governing everything from how she should dress to which radio programs she was allowed to listen to. He claimed these restrictions were necessary to protect her from corrupting influences and to maintain proper standards of German-American family life. The couple's social life was limited and carefully controlled. Carl allowed Sadie to attend church services, but insisted on accompanying her, and positioned himself where he could observe her interactions with other parishioners. He discouraged friendships with their neighbors, claiming that most Americans lacked proper moral standards and might expose Sadie to dangerous ideas about women's roles and behavior. When Sadie discovered she was pregnant in late 1929, Carl's reaction revealed the complexity of his psychological state. He wanted children to carry on his family name and prove his virility to the community, but he also feared the financial burden and the attention that children might bring to his carefully guarded private world. As the pregnancy progressed, and doctors began to suspect multiple births based on Sadie's rapid weight gain and the size of her abdomen, Carl's anxiety intensified dramatically. Multiple births, he believed, were a sign of lower breeding, something more suited to livestock than respectable German-American families. He had grown up hearing his mother's stories about the importance of genetic purity and the dangers of degeneracy, and the possibility of multiple children triggered all of his deepest fears about racial contamination and social judgment. The cultural landscape of 1930 America provided the perfect backdrop for what was to come. The country was sliding deeper into the Great Depression, making families desperate for any source of income or attention that might provide relief from economic hardship. President Hoover's promises of prosperity seemed increasingly hollow as unemployment rose and banks failed across the Midwest. Hollywood had created an insatiable appetite for child performers, with Shirley Temple becoming the nation's sweetheart and proving that talented children could earn substantial incomes for their families. Radio programs and newsreels celebrated large families as symbols of American prosperity and divine blessing, while eugenics movements quietly promoted ideas about genetic superiority and the need to protect racial purity from contamination by inferior bloodlines. On the morning of May 19, 1930, Sadie Morlok's contractions began earlier than expected, sharp pains that caught her unprepared as she was hanging laundry in the small backyard behind their apartment. Carl had left for work at dawn, muttering about overtime pay and the need to save money for the coming expenses, when the pains started coming with increasing intensity and alarming frequency. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who lived in the apartment below, heard Sadie's cries for help and immediately summoned Dr. William Henderson, her nephew, who maintained a small practice serving the working-class families of East Lansing. By the time a neighbor had been dispatched to locate Carl at the Oldsmobile factory, Sadie was already experiencing the intense labor pains that indicated imminent delivery. The journey to Edward W. Sparrow Hospital took nearly an hour through streets clogged with morning traffic and construction crews working on Depression-era public works projects. Sadie was transported in Dr. Henderson's Model T Ford, which had been hastily converted into an ambulance with blankets and pillows arranged in the back seat. Throughout the journey, her contractions intensified, and Dr. Henderson began to suspect that this would not be a routine delivery. Edward W. Sparrow Hospital was Lansing's premier medical facility, a 4-story brick building that served the entire central Michigan region. The maternity ward occupied the entire 3rd floor, with private rooms for wealthy patients and shared wards for working-class families. Sadie was admitted to a semi-private room that she would share with another woman in labor, the standard accommodation for families of modest means. Dr. Henderson had delivered hundreds of babies in his 30-year career, but he had never encountered anything like what he found that evening. The labor was unusually prolonged and difficult, with Sadie's cervix dilating slowly despite the intensity of her contractions. As the hours passed and evening turned to night, nurses began to whisper about the unusual size of the patient's abdomen and the strange patterns they were detecting when listening for fetal heartbeats. When the first infant finally emerged after nearly 16 hours of labor, Dr. Henderson prepared for the routine procedures that would follow, cutting the umbilical cord, cleaning the airways, and presenting the baby to its exhausted mother. Instead, he found himself confronting clear evidence that more children were coming. The contractions continued with undiminished intensity, and examination revealed that delivery was far from complete. The second baby arrived 20 minutes later, followed by a third after another half hour, and finally a 4th child who seemed reluctant to leave the safety of the womb. Each infant was remarkably similar to her sisters, weighing just over 4 pounds, with delicate features and wisps of blonde hair that caught the harsh hospital lighting. Their cries were synchronized, as if they were already communicating in ways that adults couldn't understand. Dr. Henderson had heard of multiple births, of course, but had never encountered quadruplets in his own practice. He knew that such births were extraordinarily rare, perhaps 1 in 15 million deliveries, and that they often resulted in infant mortality or severe developmental problems. As he examined each child, however, he found them to be healthy and well-formed, with strong reflexes and clear lung function that suggested they would survive their dramatic entrance into the world. When Carl finally arrived at the hospital, having been located after a frantic search of the factory floor and several taverns where he was known to drink after his shift, his first words would echo through the corridors and later through the family's tragic history. "What will they think my wife is, a bitch dog?" he demanded, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. "This is what happens to animals, not to decent Christian families." The nurses who heard his outburst exchanged glances of disgust and concern, but Dr. Henderson quickly ushered the new father into a private room to discuss the extraordinary nature of the births and the care that would be required in the coming weeks. "Mr. Morlok," the doctor explained patiently, "your wife has given birth to 4 identical girls. This is remarkably rare, perhaps 1 in 15 million births. These children are a medical marvel, and they're all healthy and strong." But Carl's face had already darkened with a fury that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. In his mind, multiple births were associated with animals, with the breeding practices he had observed on farms during his childhood in rural Michigan. The idea that his neighbors would whisper about his wife producing a litter filled him with a rage that would fester for decades, poisoning every aspect of his family's future. The babies, initially labeled simply as Baby A, Baby B, Baby C, and Baby D, were placed in the hospital's nursery, while Sadie recovered from the difficult delivery. The nursery staff was overwhelmed by the novelty of caring for 4 identical infants, and word of the unusual birth spread quickly through the small hospital staff. By dawn, reporters were already gathering outside the hospital, hoping for photographs and interviews. The first newspaper coverage appeared in the afternoon edition of the Lansing State Journal, with the headline, "Miracle Quadruplets, Born at Sparrow, accompanied by photographs of the tiny infants arranged in a row, each wearing identical white hospital gowns. The article described them as perfect specimens of American childhood, and noted that their birth coincided with a period of economic hardship when good news was desperately needed. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the hospital was flooded with visitors, reporters, and curiosity seekers. The telephone switchboard was jammed with calls from newspapers across the state and beyond, all seeking details about the miraculous birth. Gifts began arriving from strangers across the region. Blankets, baby clothes, toys, and cash donations from families who could barely afford to feed themselves but wanted to contribute to what they saw as a blessing. The mayor of Lansing, Harold Thompson, arrived for a photo opportunity that afternoon, bringing with him a formal proclamation declaring May 19, 1930 as Quadruplet Day in honor of the city's newest celebrities. He announced that the city would provide the Morlok family with a rent-free house for 1 year and promised that the community would support them through the challenging early months of raising 4 infants simultaneously. Local businesses competed to associate themselves with the quadruplet story. The Lansing Dairy offered free milk for the first year, Jacobson's department store provided matching outfits, and the Ford dealership promised a new automobile large enough to transport the entire family. Radio stations interviewed Dr. Henderson and hospital staff, broadcasting their descriptions of the remarkable birth to audiences across the Midwest. Carl watched this outpouring of attention with growing alarm rather than gratitude. His private family had become public property overnight, and he could already sense the loss of control that would define the rest of his life. When a local businessman suggested that the babies could be exhibited at county fairs and civic events, earning significant money for the family, Carl's paranoia about exploitation began to merge with his desperate need for financial security. The naming of the quadruplets became a community event when the Lansing State Journal sponsored a contest, receiving over 12,000 entries from across the Midwest. Families gathered around kitchen tables to suggest names. Children submitted entries as school assignments, and civic organizations treated the contest as a patriotic duty. The winning entry came from 10-year-old Margaret Sullivan, the daughter of the doctor who had assisted with the delivery, who suggested Edna, Wilma, Sarah, and Helen, names that formed the acronym EWSH, matching the initials of Edward W. Sparrow Hospital where they were born. The first 5 years of the quadruplets' lives established patterns of control and exploitation that would define their entire existence. Sadie, overwhelmed by the practical demands of caring for 4 identical infants, gradually surrendered more control to Carl, who saw opportunity where she saw only exhaustion. The constant attention from strangers, the endless stream of visitors and photographers, and the pressure to maintain their public image created stress that transformed their modest apartment into a stage where privacy became impossible. The babies required round-the-clock care that exhausted Sadie completely. Feeding 4 infants every 2 hours meant that she rarely slept for more than 90 minutes at a time. Changing, bathing, and monitoring 4 children who shared every childhood illness simultaneously pushed her to the edge of physical and emotional collapse. Carl, instead of helping with childcare, appointed himself as the family's manager and publicist, booking appearances and managing the constant stream of requests for photographs and interviews. By their first birthday in 1931, the girls were appearing regularly at local events, carried in a specially designed 4-seat stroller that had been donated by a carriage manufacturer eager for publicity. They wore matching outfits, sewn by Sadie, who worked late into the night, creating increasingly elaborate costumes for their public appearances. Carl insisted that the girls wear different colored ribbons, red for Edna, blue for Wilma, green for Sarah, and yellow for Helen, so audiences could tell them apart and develop individual attachments to each child. The family moved to a larger house on East Michigan Avenue when the girls were 18 months old, using money earned from their appearances and donations from well-wishers. The house was modest but respectable, with 3 bedrooms, a front porch and a basement, where Carl began storing the growing collection of gifts, photographs and memorabilia related to his daughter's fame. He converted one bedroom into what he called his office, where he kept detailed records of every appearance, every photograph, and every dollar earned through the girl's celebrity. Carl had discovered that his daughter's fame could open doors that his foreign accent and working-class status had kept firmly closed. He successfully ran for the position of local constable in 1932, using photographs of the quadruplets on his campaign materials with the slogan, "A man who can handle four can handle anything." The irony of this message would become apparent only decades later when the full extent of his handling was revealed to horrified investigators. The girls' performances evolved from simple appearances at church socials and community picnics to more elaborate shows featuring synchronized singing, dancing, and recitation of poems that Carl wrote specifically for them. He spent hours coaching them, insisting on perfect coordination and identical expressions. Any deviation from his script resulted in harsh punishment, administered privately where no observers could witness his methods. Sadie sewed their costumes with obsessive attention to detail, creating increasingly complex matching outfits that delighted audiences and photographers. The girls learned to move in unison, speak in harmony, and present a united front of sweetness and innocence that masked the growing tensions in their private lives. Carl monitored their performances from the wings or the audience, ready to intervene if any of them showed signs of independence or spontaneity. Behind the public facade, Carl's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and controlling. He installed locks on the girls' bedroom doors, claiming he needed to protect them from outside influences and potential kidnapping attempts. He monitored their conversations with each other, often listening outside their door or questioning them separately about what they had discussed. Any mail addressed to the girls was opened and read by Carl before they were allowed to see it, and most letters from admirers were destroyed rather than shared. The girls attended Elmwood Elementary School, but their experience there was far from normal. Carl insisted on driving them to school each morning and picking them up each afternoon, never allowing them to walk with other children or participate in after-school activities. He positioned himself where he could observe their classroom windows during recess, claiming he was protecting them from potential harm, but actually monitoring their interactions with teachers and classmates. Teachers at Elmwood Elementary noticed that the girls seemed unusually fearful of making mistakes and would often glance nervously toward windows as if expecting to be watched. They rarely participated in class discussions unless directly called upon, and they showed little interest in forming friendships with their classmates. When other children approached them during recess, the quadruplets would huddle together, speaking in whispers and looking anxiously toward the school windows where they knew their father might be watching. Miss Catherine Reynolds, their third-grade teacher, attempted to discuss her concerns with Carl during a parent conference in 1934. She noted that the girls seemed isolated from their peers and suggested that they might benefit from more opportunities to develop individual interests and friendships. Carl's response was immediate and hostile, accusing Miss Reynolds of trying to corrupt his daughters with modern educational theories that undermined parental authority and traditional family values. The family's isolation deepened as Carl's paranoia expanded to include neighbors, teachers, and even extended family members. He began expressing admiration for European political movements that emphasized racial purity and strong patriarchal authority, collecting German-language newspapers and pamphlets that promoted Nazi ideology. His comments about Jewish people, immigrants, and African Americans became increasingly vitriolic, though he was careful to moderate his language when speaking to reporters or public officials who might damage his public image. As the girls entered their teenage years, the performances continued, but their content began to shift in disturbing ways. Carl insisted that they perform songs about the importance of feminine purity and obedience to paternal authority. He wrote many of the lyrics himself, compositions that emphasized their role as representatives of American innocence and the dangers that threatened young women who strayed from proper behavior. He would watch from the wings as they sang these songs, his eyes fixed on their faces with an intensity that made other observers uncomfortable. By 1948, when the quadruplets turned 18, the carefully constructed public image of the perfect family was beginning to show cracks that even Carl's iron control couldn't completely hide. Local reporters who had followed their story for nearly 2 decades began to notice inconsistencies in the family's public statements and the girls' increasingly strained appearances at community events. The synchronized perfection that had once charmed audiences now seemed forced and artificial, with moments of discord that suggested deeper problems. Sarah, who had always been the most outspoken of the four, began displaying behaviors that concerned those who knew the family. During interviews, she would sometimes start conversations and then stop mid-sentence, staring into space with a look of profound confusion. Her answers to simple questions became increasingly rambling and disconnected, filled with references to watchers and judges that made no sense to listeners. During performances, she occasionally sang lyrics that didn't match those of her sisters, creating discord in the previously perfect harmony that had been their trademark for nearly 2 decades. Helen, the youngest by a matter of minutes, had become almost completely silent in public, speaking only when directly addressed, and then in whispers that audiences often couldn't hear. Teachers who had worked with the girls during their brief periods of public schooling reported that Helen seemed to exist in a world of her own making, often drawing disturbing images of faceless figures and burning houses during art lessons. Her artwork was filled with symbols that adults couldn't interpret. Eyes floating above doorways, children standing in cages, figures with their mouths sewn shut. Edna had begun experiencing what she described as episodes during which she would become convinced that strangers were following her, or that familiar objects in their home had been moved or replaced by identical substitutes. Her paranoia seemed to echo Carl's own obsessions, but where his fears focused on external threats to the family's reputation and purity, hers centered on the idea that reality itself was unstable and unreliable. She would spend hours examining photographs of herself and her sisters, convinced that the images had been altered or that the faces looking back at her belonged to strangers. Wilma developed severe insomnia, often staying awake for days at a time while pacing their bedroom and muttering to herself in a language that seemed to be a mixture of English and German phrases she had overheard from Carl's political materials. When she did sleep, she experienced vivid nightmares that she would describe in frightening detail to her sisters. Dreams of being trapped in mirrors or performing for audiences of faceless figures who applauded silently with bleeding hands. The family's physician, Dr. Morrison, had grown increasingly concerned about the girls' mental state and had quietly begun researching their symptoms in his medical journals. What he found suggested that all 4 sisters might be developing signs of what psychiatrists were beginning to call schizophrenia, a condition that often emerged in early adulthood and could be triggered by prolonged stress or trauma. The symmetry of their symptoms was particularly troubling, suggesting either a shared genetic predisposition or a common environmental trigger that had affected all 4 identically. When Dr. Morrison approached Carl with his concerns, suggesting that the girls might benefit from psychiatric evaluation and possibly medication or therapy, Carl's reaction was explosive and revealing. He accused the doctor of being part of a conspiracy to destroy his family, claiming that Jewish psychiatrists and communist sympathizers were using mental health treatments to undermine traditional American values and destroy family unity. He immediately began searching for a new physician who would be more understanding of what he called normal family discipline and less influenced by degenerate modern theories. The community's perception of the Morlok family began to shift as stories of Carl's increasingly bizarre behavior reached local law enforcement and social service agencies. His work as a constable had become erratic and concerning, with reports that he would spend entire shifts parked outside the high school, watching for what he called degenerate influences among the students. He had begun making arrests based on his personal moral judgments rather than actual violations of law, targeting young couples for public displays of affection and immigrants for what he considered suspicious behavior. In 1949, a social worker named Helen Rodriguez began investigating reports that the Morlok girls were being isolated from their peers and subjected to unusual restrictions that might constitute educational neglect or psychological abuse. Her visits to the family home were brief and carefully choreographed by Carl, who would present his daughters as model citizens who were simply dedicated to their performance career and their family obligations. But Rodriguez noticed details that troubled her professional instincts. The way the girls moved in perfect synchronization, even when they thought no one was watching. their identical posture and facial expressions, and most disturbing of all, the way they would sometimes finish each other's sentences, even when speaking to strangers. It was as if their individual personalities were being subsumed into a single, carefully controlled identity that existed more for their father's benefit than their own development. Rodriguez also observed Carl's behavior during her visits, noting his constant interruptions when she tried to speak with the girls individually and his insistence on providing answers to questions directed at his daughters. When she suggested that the girls might benefit from individual counseling or participation in normal teenage social activities, Carl became agitated and defensive, claiming that outside influences were trying to corrupt his family and destroy their special bond. The breaking point came in late 1950 when Edna experienced what witnesses described as a complete psychological breakdown during a performance at a Thanksgiving community celebration held at the Lansing Civic Center. The Quadruplets were performing their signature song, America the Beautiful, when Edna suddenly stopped singing and began screaming that the audience members were watching us die and that father's monsters were hiding behind their faces. The audience, initially confused by what seemed like a dramatic interpretation of the song, gradually realized that something was seriously wrong. Edna's screams became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to invisible judges, burning houses, and children trapped in mirrors. The other three sisters continued singing as if nothing had happened, their voices maintaining perfect harmony, while Edna was led from the stage by horrified volunteers. Carl's response to his daughter's public breakdown was swift and brutal. Rather than seeking medical attention for Edna, he confined her to the basement of their home for 3 days, claiming she was suffering from feminine hysteria that could be cured through isolation and prayer. When she was finally allowed to rejoin the family, Edna seemed different, quieter, more compliant, but also more disconnected from reality than before. The aftermath of Edna's public breakdown forced Carl to confront the reality that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. But rather than seeking help for his daughter, he decided to implement even stricter controls, convinced that outside influences were responsible for what he saw as Edna's temporary weakness. The incident had been witnessed by hundreds of people, including several local officials and reporters, making it impossible to dismiss or explain away as a minor family problem. Carl's response revealed the full extent of his paranoid delusions and his complete inability to recognize his own role in his daughter's psychological deterioration. He became convinced that enemies of his family, Jewish psychiatrists, communist sympathizers, and racial degenerates, were using psychological warfare to destroy what he saw as a symbol of American racial and moral superiority. The Quadruplets, in his twisted worldview, represented everything that was pure and good about white Christian America, and their corruption would signal the triumph of degeneracy over traditional values. The family home became a fortress as Carl implemented security measures that isolated his daughters even further from normal social contact. He installed additional locks on all exterior doors and windows, purchased heavy curtains to prevent neighbors from seeing inside, and began keeping detailed logs of anyone who approached the house or showed interest in his family. He purchased a rifle, which he claimed was for hunting, but which neighbors noticed he cleaned obsessively while sitting on his front porch, watching the street with suspicious intensity. Carl's surveillance of his daughters extended to every aspect of their daily lives. He installed a system of mirrors that allowed him to monitor their activities from his basement workshop, and he required them to account for every minute of their time when he was not physically present. Their correspondence was not only read, but copied and filed in detailed records that documented every interaction with the outside world. Inside the house, the girls' daily routines became increasingly rigid and bizarre. Carl instituted what he called purity inspections, requiring his daughters to submit to physical examinations that he claimed were necessary to ensure they hadn't been contaminated by outside influences. These inspections, conducted in the basement where he had set up what he described as a medical facility, became more frequent and more invasive as his paranoia deepened and his obsession with their physical development intensified. The basement had been transformed into Carl's private domain, where he could conduct his examinations and maintain his surveillance records without interference. He had installed a medical examination table purchased from a hospital supply company, along with instruments and supplies that he claimed were necessary for proper hygiene and health monitoring. The walls were covered with charts tracking his daughter's physical development, menstrual cycles, and what he called behavioral anomalies. Sadie, who had long ago learned to avoid confronting her husband directly, began showing signs of severe depression as she witnessed the escalating abuse of her daughters. Neighbors reported seeing her standing at windows for hours at a time, staring out at the street with an expression of profound hopelessness. Her physical appearance deteriorated markedly, with dramatic weight loss and premature aging that suggested chronic stress and possibly inadequate nutrition. When approached by concerned community members, Sadie would insist that everything in the Morlok household was perfectly normal, and that her family was simply more dedicated to proper values than others. Her responses seemed rehearsed and artificial, as if she had been coached on what to say to deflect outside concern. She would often glance nervously around during these conversations, as if she expected to be overheard or monitored. The quadruplets' behavior became increasingly synchronized and disturbing as they adapted to their father's escalating demands for control and perfection. They had developed what psychologists would later recognize as a shared delusional system, in which they believed that they were constantly being watched and evaluated by invisible judges who would punish them for any deviation from perfect obedience. Their conversations, even in private, followed scripts that seemed rehearsed and artificial. They spoke in whispers when they thought they were alone, but even these private conversations revealed the extent to which Carl's paranoid worldview had infected their understanding of reality. They referred to neighbors as watchers, to teachers as corruptors, and to anyone who showed kindness or interest as potential infiltrators, sent to test their loyalty to family values. Dr. Peterson, the new family physician Carl had found after dismissing Dr. Morrison, was less experienced and more easily intimidated by Carl's authoritarian presence. He was a recent medical school graduate who had established his practice in Lansing, partly because the established physicians in larger cities were unwilling to accept his credentials from a less prestigious institution. When the girls began experiencing more frequent and severe symptoms, hallucinations, periods of catatonic silence, and episodes of uncontrolled crying, Peterson attributed these to feminine hysteria and prescribed bed rest and increased supervision. Peterson's medical records, which would later be subpoenaed during the investigation, revealed his complete failure to recognize the signs of severe psychological abuse and emerging mental illness. His notes described the quadruplets as high-strung and overly sensitive, but he made no effort to examine them privately or to question the unusual restrictions their father had imposed on their lives. The community's awareness of the family's problems was growing, but Carl's position as constable and the family's long-standing public image made intervention difficult. Those who expressed concern were dismissed as troublemakers or jealous neighbors who resented the Morlok family's fame and success. Carl had cultivated relationships with local politicians and business leaders who saw him as a pillar of the community, making it easy for him to deflect criticism and discredit anyone who questioned his methods. In early 1952, when the girls were 22, a traveling psychiatrist named Dr. Benjamin Strauss visited Lansing as part of a speaking tour about advances in mental health treatment. Dr. Strauss was a refugee from Nazi Germany who had witnessed firsthand the consequences of racial ideology and authoritarian family structures. He had heard rumors about the famous quadruplets and their recent difficulties, and he made what he thought was a routine courtesy call to offer his professional services. Carl's reaction to Dr. Strauss's visit revealed the full extent of his paranoia and his increasingly explicit Nazi sympathies. The confrontation began calmly, with Carl initially presenting his usual facade of respectability, but it quickly escalated as Dr. Strauss asked questions about the girls' recent behavioral problems and suggested that professional evaluation might be beneficial. Carl accused the Jewish psychiatrist of being part of an international conspiracy to undermine American families and destroy racial purity through psychological manipulation. The confrontation, which occurred on the front porch where neighbors could witness it, included Karl's declaration that Hitler should have finished the job, and his prediction that America would soon need its own final solution to deal with racial and moral degenerates. Dr. Strauss, shaken by the encounter and recognizing the dangerous ideology that was driving Karl's behavior, immediately contacted state mental health authorities and local law enforcement. His detailed report described a family in severe crisis, with clear evidence of psychological abuse and possible physical harm. He recommended immediate intervention and psychiatric evaluation for all family members, warning that delay could result in permanent psychological damage or even physical violence. The morning of April 15, 1952, would forever divide the Morlok family's story into before and after. State mental health investigators, accompanied by county sheriff's deputies, arrived at the small, clapboard house on East Michigan Avenue with legal authority to conduct welfare checks on all family members. The investigation team was led by Dr. Margaret Collins, a psychiatric social worker with extensive experience in cases involving family dysfunction, and Detective Raymond Murphy, a veteran police officer who specialized in crimes against children. What they found inside would shock even experienced professionals who thought they had seen every form of family dysfunction imaginable. The house appeared normal from the outside, freshly painted, well-maintained, with a garden that suggested pride in home ownership. But the interior revealed a level of control and surveillance that transformed a family home into something resembling a prison or laboratory. The living areas of the house were sparse and sterile, with furniture arranged to provide clear sightlines from Karl's chair to every other location. Religious imagery dominated the walls, but closer examination revealed that many of the pictures had been altered with Karl's handwritten additions that transformed biblical verses into justifications for paternal authority and racial purity. Family photographs showed the girls at various ages, but their arrangement followed a disturbing pattern. Images documenting their physical development were grouped together with detailed notations in Karl's handwriting. The basement, which Karl had kept locked and off-limits to visitors for years, revealed the true scope of his paranoid obsessions and his systematic abuse of his daughters. The investigators descended the wooden stairs to find a space that had been converted into what could only be described as a surveillance and examination center. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs of the girls taken without their knowledge, images captured through windows, doorways, and mirrors that documented their daily activities with the obsessive detail of a criminal investigation. The photographs were organized chronologically and by subject, with separate sections devoted to each daughter's physical development, social interactions, and what Karl had labeled as behavioral anomalies. Some images showed the girls in various states of undress, apparently taken during what Karl had described to investigators as medical examinations. The systematic nature of this documentation suggested years of covert surveillance that went far beyond normal parental concern. More disturbing were the detailed written logs that Karl had maintained, filling dozens of notebooks with observations about his daughters' conversations, their physical development, their menstrual cycles, and what he described as evidence of their moral corruption by outside influences. The logs revealed a level of invasive monitoring that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations, including detailed records of the girls' bathroom habits, their sleep patterns, and transcripts of conversations they had thought were private. Dr. Collins noted that the logs contained extensive references to Nazi racial theory and eugenics literature, with Karl attempting to analyze his daughter's behavior through the lens of genetic purity and racial superiority. He had recorded his observations about which daughter showed signs of degenerate tendencies, and had developed elaborate theories about how outside influences were attempting to corrupt their genetic inheritance. The medical facility that Karl had established in the basement included an examination table purchased from a hospital supply company, along with instruments that he claimed were necessary for monitoring his daughter's health and purity. The investigators found evidence that these examinations had become increasingly invasive and frequent over the years, with detailed charts tracking what Karl called purity measurements and contamination indicators. Detective Murphy discovered a locked cabinet that contained additional documentation of Carl's obsessions, including correspondence with white supremacist organizations, Nazi propaganda materials, and detailed plans for what he called protective measures that would be necessary if his family came under attack from racial enemies. The cabinet also contained photographs and personal items belonging to his daughters that appeared to have been taken without their knowledge or consent. Upstairs, the girls' bedroom revealed additional evidence of their father's comprehensive control over their lives. The walls were covered with handwritten rules governing every aspect of their behavior, from detailed instructions about personal hygiene to elaborate protocols for interactions with strangers. The rules were written in Carl's distinctive handwriting and covered topics ranging from proper posture during performances to acceptable topics of conversation with outsiders. Their clothing was stored in locked cabinets, with outfits selected and laid out by Carl each morning, according to detailed schedules that he maintained. The investigators found evidence that he monitored his daughter's clothing for signs of wear or staining that might indicate unauthorized activities or moral failings. Even their undergarments were subject to his inspection and approval. Perhaps most disturbing were the journals that investigators found hidden beneath the girls' mattresses, written in a code that took expert cryptographers weeks to decipher. These journals revealed the full extent of their psychological deterioration and their shared delusions about being constantly watched and judged by invisible authorities. The code appeared to have been developed by the girls as a way of communicating without their father's knowledge, but the content suggested that even their private thoughts had been contaminated by his paranoid worldview. Sarah's journal entries described elaborate fantasies about escape and revenge, but also periods of complete dissociation during which she felt like she was watching her life from outside her own body. She wrote about the Watchers, who observed everything they did, and the judges who would punish them for any violation of their father's rules. Her entries revealed a sophisticated understanding of her family's dysfunction, but also a growing inability to distinguish between her father's surveillance and imaginary observers. Helen's writings revealed a rich internal world of imaginary companions who offered protection from what she called the Watchers, but also episodes of violent rage that she struggled to control. Her journal contained detailed descriptions of fantasies involving the destruction of their house and the death of their father, alternating with expressions of guilt and self-hatred for having such thoughts. Edna's journal documented her growing conviction that reality itself was unstable, with detailed observations about how familiar objects seemed to change when she wasn't looking, and how people's faces would sometimes shift into those of strangers. She had developed elaborate theories about parallel dimensions and duplicate realities, suggesting a complete break from consensual reality that had probably been developing for years. Wilma's entries focused obsessively on themes of performance and perfection, revealing her terror of making mistakes that might bring punishment from what she described as the judges. Her writing showed signs of severe anxiety and perfectionism, but also periods of catatonic withdrawal during which she seemed unable to function normally. When the investigators attempted to interview Carl, his responses revealed the full extent of his delusional system and his complete lack of insight into the harm he had inflicted on his family. He insisted that his daughters were being targeted by an international conspiracy of Jewish psychiatrists, communist sympathizers, and racial degenerates who wanted to corrupt American youth and destroy white racial purity. Carl claimed that his strict supervision was the only thing protecting his daughters from moral destruction, and that any problems they experienced were the result of insufficient isolation from harmful influences. He presented detailed theories about how psychiatric treatment was being used as a weapon against traditional American families, and how his daughters' fame had made them targets for those who wanted to undermine racial superiority. His Nazi sympathies, which he had previously kept relatively hidden, emerged fully during the interrogation. He openly praised Hitler's policies toward mental patients and proclaimed his belief that America needed similar programs to eliminate genetic defectives and social undesirables. His statements were so extreme and coherent that investigators realized they were dealing not with simple child abuse, but with a systematic implementation of fascist ideology within an American family. Carl's statements revealed his complete inability to recognize his daughters as individuals with their own needs and rights. He spoke about them as if they were possessions or experiments, describing his surveillance and examinations as necessary research into genetic purity and racial superiority. He showed no remorse for the psychological damage he had inflicted and insisted that his methods were scientifically sound and morally justified. Sadie, when questioned separately from her husband, revealed years of psychological and physical abuse that she had endured while trying to protect her daughters from the worst of Carl's obsessions. She described Carl's increasing obsession with controlling every aspect of their lives and his violent reactions to any suggestion that his methods were harmful or unusual. Her testimony provided crucial evidence of the systematic nature of the abuse and its escalation over the preceding decade. Sadie's account revealed that she had attempted to seek help on several occasions, but Carl's position in the community and his skill at presenting a respectable facade had made it difficult for her to convince authorities that serious abuse was occurring. She had been threatened with violence if she disclosed family secrets, and she lived in constant fear that any attempt to protect her daughters would result in even worse treatment for them. The girls themselves, when finally interviewed away from their father's presence, struggled to communicate with their interrogators in ways that revealed the profound impact of their abuse. Years of isolation and psychological manipulation had left them unable to distinguish between reality and the elaborate delusional system their father had imposed upon them. Their responses were often contradictory and confused, suggesting severe psychological trauma that would require extensive treatment. Dr. Collins noted that the girls displayed symptoms of what would later be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, including dissociation, hypervigilance, and an inability to form normal social relationships. Their shared delusional system had become so entrenched that they had difficulty accepting that their father's surveillance and examinations were abnormal or harmful. The decision to remove all 4 girls from their family home and place them under psychiatric care was made within hours of the initial investigation. Carl's arrest on charges of child abuse, sexual assault, and endangerment marked the end of the Morlok Quadruplets' public performance career and the beginning of their transformation into the most studied family in American psychiatric history. The aftermath of the Morlok family's collapse reverberated through multiple institutions and communities, each trying to understand how such systematic abuse could have continued for so long without effective intervention. The case exposed fundamental failures in social services, law enforcement, and community oversight that allowed a dangerous individual to maintain a facade of respectability while inflicting severe psychological damage on his children. The National Institute of Mental Health, newly established as part of the federal government's growing commitment to medical research, saw in the quadruplets an unprecedented opportunity to study the relationship between genetics and mental illness. The timing was perfect for the Institute's ambitious research agenda, which sought to establish psychiatry as a legitimate medical science with the same empirical foundations as other branches of medicine. Dr. David Rosenthal, an ambitious young psychiatrist at NIMH, convinced his superiors that the Morlok case represented a perfect natural experiment that could resolve long-standing debates about the causes of schizophrenia. 4 genetically identical individuals, all diagnosed with the same mental illness, raised in the same environment. It seemed like the ideal way to determine whether psychiatric disorders were primarily caused by heredity or upbringing. The decision to study the quadruplets was made quickly, with little consideration for the ethical implications of using traumatized young women as research subjects. The prevailing attitudes in psychiatric research emphasized the importance of scientific knowledge over patient welfare, and the girls' consent was considered less important than the potential benefits to medical science. To protect the family's privacy and avoid the sensational media coverage that had defined their early years, the researchers assigned them the pseudonym Genain, derived from Greek words meaning dire birth or dreadful gene. The irony of this name, given the circumstances of their fame and suffering, was apparently lost on the scientists who would spend the next 3 decades studying them as if they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings. The girls were transported to the NIMH facility in Bethesda, Maryland in the summer of 1952, beginning a new phase of their exploitation that would continue for decades. For the first time in their lives, they were separated from their parents and from each other, housed in individual rooms where they could begin the slow process of developing independent identities free from their father's surveillance and control. The NIMH facility was a sprawling complex of modern buildings designed to project an image of scientific sophistication and medical authority. The quadruplets were housed in a special ward that had been designed for long-term research subjects, with comfortable accommodations but constant monitoring that reminded them uncomfortably of their father's surveillance methods. The initial psychiatric evaluations confirmed what investigators had suspected. All four sisters showed clear signs of schizophrenia, but their symptoms varied significantly in severity and type. The evaluations took months to complete, with batteries of psychological tests, medical examinations, and detailed interviews that documented every aspect of their psychological functioning. Sarah demonstrated the most intact social functioning and would eventually be able to live independently with minimal supervision. Her intelligence and resilience had allowed her to maintain some capacity for critical thinking despite years of psychological abuse. Edna showed more severe symptoms but retained enough connection to reality to participate in treatment programs. Wilma's condition was marked by severe anxiety and perfectionism that made normal social functioning difficult. Helen's condition was the most severe, with symptoms that would require institutionalization for most of her adult life. What the NIMH researchers failed to recognize or chose to ignore was the role that their father's abuse and Nazi ideology had played in their psychological development. The published studies focused almost exclusively on genetic factors and family dynamics, treating Carl's extremist beliefs and systematic abuse as irrelevant side notes rather than central causes of his daughter's suffering. The research methodology reflected the biases and limitations of 1950s psychiatry, which was dominated by psychoanalytic theories that blamed mothers for their children's mental illness while ignoring or minimizing paternal abuse. The researchers spent considerable time analyzing Sadie's personality and parenting style while devoting minimal attention to Carl's documented history of violence, surveillance, and ideological extremism. Dr. Rosenthal and his colleagues were particularly interested in documenting genetic factors that might predispose individuals to schizophrenia, and they interpreted the quadruplets' shared diagnosis as evidence that mental illness was primarily hereditary. They paid less attention to the obvious environmental factors that had shaped the girls' development, including social isolation, psychological abuse, and exposure to extremist ideology. The research conducted on the Genain Quadruplets would influence American psychiatry for decades, supporting theories about the genetic basis of schizophrenia while overlooking the obvious environmental factors that had shaped their development. The 600-page study published in 1963 became a landmark in psychiatric literature, cited in textbooks and research papers around the world as evidence that mental illness was primarily biological rather than psychological or social in origin. The publication of the Genain Quadruplets, a case study and theoretical analysis of heredity and environment in schizophrenia, brought international attention to Dr. Rosenthal's work and established his reputation as a leading researcher in psychiatric genetics. The book was praised for its methodological rigor and comprehensive documentation, but critics noted its failure to adequately address the role of trauma and abuse in the girl's psychological development. Carl Morlok served less than 2 years in prison for his crimes against his daughters, a sentence that reflected the limited understanding of psychological abuse that prevailed in the 1950s legal system. The charges against him focused primarily on physical abuse and neglect, with prosecutors struggling to articulate the full scope of the psychological damage he had inflicted through his surveillance and control methods. Upon his release from prison in 1954, Carl disappeared from public view, though some reports suggest he continued to maintain contact with white supremacist groups and Nazi sympathizers who shared his racial ideology. He never showed any remorse for his treatment of his daughters and continued to insist that his methods had been scientifically sound and morally justified. Sadie lived quietly in a small apartment in Lansing until her death in 1967. never speaking publicly about her family's experiences or the years of abuse she had endured. She maintained minimal contact with her daughters during their hospitalization and seemed unable to overcome the trauma of her marriage and the guilt she felt about her failure to protect her children. The quadruplets themselves followed divergent paths after their release from NIMH supervision in the late 1950s. Sarah, the most resilient of the four, eventually married and had children, though she struggled with episodes of mental illness throughout her life. She became an advocate for psychiatric patients' rights and spoke critically about the way her family had been exploited by both the media and the scientific community. Sarah's marriage to Robert Cotton, a social worker who had been involved in her treatment, provided her with the stability and support she needed to build a relatively normal life. She had 2 sons who showed no signs of mental illness, contradicting some of the genetic theories that had been based on her family's case. Her advocacy work focused on protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation by researchers and institutions. Edna and Wilma spent decades in and out of psychiatric institutions, their conditions stabilizing somewhat with the development of new medications, but never fully recovering from their traumatic childhoods. Both women struggled with chronic mental illness that made independent living difficult, though they were able to maintain relationships with their sister Sarah and participated in family gatherings when their conditions permitted. Helen remained institutionalized for most of her adult life, though she found some peace in art therapy and creative writing that allowed her to express experiences that she couldn't communicate verbally. Her artwork provided insights into her internal world that complemented the clinical observations of her caregivers, revealing a rich imagination that had survived despite her severe psychological impairment. The long-term follow-up studies continued well into the 1990s, with researchers tracking the sisters' health, their children's development, and any signs of genetic transmission of mental illness. These studies, while providing valuable data about the course of psychiatric disorders, also represented a continuation of the exploitation that had defined their entire lives. The research findings generally supported the conclusion that genetic factors played a significant role in the development of schizophrenia, but they also demonstrated the profound impact of environmental factors such as trauma, abuse, and social isolation. The quadruplets case became more complex and nuanced over time, challenging simple genetic explanations and highlighting the importance of considering both biological and environmental influences. In the 1980s and 1990s, as understanding of trauma and its psychological effects expanded, some researchers began to re-examine the Genain Quadruplets case with fresh perspectives that emphasized the role of their father's abuse in their psychological development. These reanalyses suggested that their mental illness might have been preventable with appropriate intervention and protection from abuse. Today, only Sarah survives, now in her 90s and living in a care facility near her adult children. In recent years, she has spoken more openly about her family's experiences, working with author Audrey Claire Farley to ensure that the full story of the Genain Quadruplets includes the racism, abuse, and systematic exploitation that shaped their lives. Sarah's collaboration with researchers and authors has been motivated by her desire to prevent similar exploitation of vulnerable individuals and to ensure that her family's suffering serves some constructive purpose. She has been particularly critical of the way that Nazi ideology and racial extremism were minimized or ignored in the original research, arguing that these factors were central to understanding her father's behavior and her family's destruction. The case of the Morlok Genain Quadruplets serves as a disturbing reminder of how scientific objectivity can be used to obscure uncomfortable truths about family violence, political extremism, and institutional complicity. Their story forces us to ask difficult questions about the price of scientific knowledge and the responsibility we bear for protecting vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit them in the name of progress. The legacy of their case extends beyond psychiatry to broader questions about research ethics, the protection of human subjects, and the responsibility of institutions to recognize and address abuse. Modern research protocols that require informed consent and ethical oversight were developed partly in response to cases like the Genain Quadruplets, where vulnerable individuals were subjected to extensive study without adequate protection of their rights and welfare. Their story also highlights the dangers of ideological extremism within families and communities, showing how Nazi ideology and racial hatred can destroy lives even in seemingly respectable American settings. Karl Morlok's ability to maintain a public facade while implementing fascist principles in his private life demonstrates the importance of recognizing and confronting extremism wherever it appears. What do you think about this tragic case? How could a family's suffering be ignored for so long by a community that claimed to care about them? Could better systems have prevented this systematic abuse and exploitation, or were the social attitudes of the era too accepting of patriarchal authority to recognize the warning signs? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story as disturbing as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest historical mysteries. The truth about the Genain Quadruplets reminds us that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones living in plain sight, protected by respectability and scientific authority, and that the price of ignoring abuse can echo through generations.